Hey everybody, welcome to the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. This is Jesse Firestone. Today is the September 2025 Ask Me Anything episode. Just a quick reminder before we get started, these episodes are supported by my Patreon. So if you want to ask questions for the AMAs, or if you want lots of bonus content, I just posted 2 new videos on there over the last month. They're about 10-minute long technical videos talking about concepts in climbing technique, which I'm demonstrating on my board. I'm going to try to do at least one of those a month from now on. So if you want those, if you want to ask questions, and if you want the whole backlog of bonus content, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/innerfireclimbing. Just $5. I don't have any tiers or anything fancy like that. So $5 for better climbing. All right, let's jump into the questions with Kyle. How would you describe the differences, if any, of your visualization process on a flash attempt versus a red point? On red point goes, I'm recreating what it feels like to be in each position and execute the moves. On flash goes, I'm mostly just imagining the sequence, but I don't have the same tactile visualization. Other than just getting a lot more reps, do you have any tips for moving my flash visualization process closer to my red point? Okay, great question from Kyle. I love talking about visualization. I recently did a test piece podcast where we chatted about visualization about halfway through, I think. And I actually went into some detail there about some different visualization strategies that I use for different boulders I've done and a couple different routes I've done, and kind of how variable those things are. So I wouldn't say that I have a strict, perfect process, but the longer I project something, the more likely that my visualization is going to be unique for that project. And if it's something that I'm just going to try, a few times, maybe it's a boulder that I can do quickly, great, I can do quickly, or maybe it's something I'm trying to flash, that day, but it's not been a plan in my mind for a long time to flash it, then I'm probably just doing, a combination of internal visualization. So like from my POV, but more likely like tactile visualization, trying to feel what the body positions are going to feel like. And when Kyle says imagining the sequence, that's really what I think of as imagining the sequence. So sort of feeling in my mind what I think I'm going to feel in my body. And then that's kind of my default for both flashing and red pointing. And then as I try things more, I'll get into more details of sensations and emotions and things like that. As far as making the flash visualization more similar to the red point, I think lots of reps really is the best answer. I wish I had a better answer than that, but that probably is the right one. But I would say it can be practiced quite overtly. Like you can make those reps higher quality. So you can go touch the holds, at least the holds that you can reach from the ground. That's legal for a flash try. On sighting, obviously you can't touch the holds, and there could be some debate about whether you're allowed to stand on a pad or climb up a ladder and touch the holds. Those are ethical gray areas, but certainly the holds you can reach from the ground, you're allowed to touch. So there's no reason to think that you can't do at least the minimal tactile visualization of knowing what those holds will feel like. But I do think, having a wider base of experience gives your body kind of an idea of what to expect. Like if you think about piano, there's been lots of research in visualization done on piano players. And I find that to be like pretty comparable to climbing, just in the sense of it's very coordinated, lots of different things happening at the same time. They, tend to repeat it at a slower tempo and then increase the tempo as they become more masterful. All things that are very similar to climbing. It's like you can master what one hand is doing and what the other hand is doing separately, and then bring them together and still be a master. So like the left hand can be playing chords, which is very normal in piano, and the right hand can be doing something more melodic. And a really good piano player is going to be very good at both of those things. And then you can have them play a piece that has those things in a different combination than what they've ever done, but they're still going to be able to visualize that combination, even though it's unique. And I think we get the same thing in climbing. Like you're going to run into the upper body is doing something familiar, the lower body is doing something familiar, but you've never done it in that combination before. And it's going to be a little bit different from what you might expect, but you could still visualize some part of it. You can get your visualization like 60% of the way there, or 70% of the way there, and that's still a hell of a lot better than just pulling on with no idea what you're doing. So I think like with lots of things in climbing, putting in the practice and at least taking a shot at it is probably very valuable, especially for visualizing before flash attempts. So yeah, trying to think if I have any other advice there. Maybe the last thing I'll say is I'm very willing with flash tries to go look at boulders lots of times. And I think part of what I'm doing when I do that is I'm enhancing the quality of my tactile visualization for the eventual flash attempt. Definitely worth going back to things that you want to try to flash many times. Okay, jumping into the deep philosophical end of the pool with Sam's question here. Sam says, I constantly hear the phrase, quote, a better climber, unquote, and it's always in reference to someone who has moved up the grade scale. But I struggle with the idea that grades alone define improvement and what makes someone a better climber. Ascending harder climbs is one measure among countless others, such as fluidity of movement, creativity on the rock, patience in failure, presence in risk, or even the way someone supports their partners, inspires others, and cares for their outdoor environment. To me, the phrase a better climber seems less like a destination and more like a question without a final answer, the same way becoming a more complete human being can never be reduced to one metric. Are the climbers who climb the highest grades better climbers? Some of them are undoubtedly, but I believe it's because of many other factors as well. Some climbers only climb hard with no other attributes on their resume. Does this mean that these climbers are better than those who don't climb as hard, but do have other attributes such as the aforementioned abilities listed above? Good question there from Sam, and something I think about pretty often as well. I think this will be the first mention on the podcast of the Firestone's greater theory of climbing progression, or I don't have a better name for it than that, but I've always kind of had this this theory in mind that it seems like the better someone is at climbing, and almost like the earlier they get really good at climbing, just the more clunky they are in other parts of their life. Like I think a lot of us have met people who are sort of climbing prodigies, but you see them perform what seems like an everyday task, like cooking an egg or something, and you're sort of like aghast at what, they seem to lack these fundamental skills. And then you're like, oh, got it. While we were all learning how to cook eggs without burning them, like you were flashing V12. And that's the single thing that you got really, really good at. And I mean, that's like a tongue-in-cheek sort of way to answer the question, right? But yeah, we all make a sacrifice, I suppose. So yeah, I think defining what a better climber means, like what you mean by that, definitely helps narrow down the conversation. And I can't deny the Alex Lowe quote about the best climber is the one having the most fun, which is probably also tongue-in-cheek. But then you look at Adam Ondra, and the guy is just overflowing with enthusiasm for climbing at all times. Like no matter what type of climbing he's doing, it can be chossy limestone turd or like the sickest thing in the world. And he's in both cases just like turbo stoked to be climbing on it. And I think there's a lot of power in that. I just mentioned Test Piece a minute ago. And one thing Josh from Test Piece said in our podcast is like, you're going to get good at the things that you enjoy doing. And so if you think about Adam as being a climber who seems to enjoy all aspects of climbing, like that's probably not a coincidence that he's gotten pretty good at all aspects of climbing too. I think Sam's list of things, he said harder climbs is one measure among others, and then listed some things that seem to be elements of good climbing. And in my opinion, here's some things that make up the best climber. So you have really good emotional regulation, like you either have low levels of fear or anxiety, or you're very good at managing your fear or anxiety and putting in a good performance despite dealing with those things, which that latter is probably more likely. You can get in the zone on command. I think that's honestly very important. I think it's something that a lot of people really struggle with, but doing it on command could either be you have some kind of process, some kind of pre-flight that puts you in the zone, or it's like once you start climbing, you just find yourself in the zone. I think both of those can work for different people, but you need some way to access flow. That is definitely a key part of being a good climber. I think you need to have really good project selection. So you need to be able to choose things that are challenging for you. Like they're probably going to be, right at the cutting edge of what you can do, but you can do them. So you need a really good understanding of your abilities and exactly what you can bring to bear. The best climber is going to have a very low number of unforced errors. So things like doing the wrong sequence or making the same mistake that they just made, or like not resting enough. One that I struggle with constantly is like showing up with a nick in my skin or like a flapper or something and like not taping it and like reopening that wound on my warm up. That's like an unforced error that I seem to make quite often. The best climbers can repeat the same very technical moves on subsequent tries. Like they have a very low miss rate when they are doing the right sequence. So, each subsequent attempt is usually going to be a little better than the previous one. That is a hallmark of a good climber. They need to have a good understanding of how climbing works. And that's a really vague and personal thing, but they just have some kind of internal logic, When they're trying a really hard project, they're not just casting about and like wobbling through the process. Like they kind of have an understanding of where they're at in the process and what they're trying to do. What are they trying to get out of this session or this try? Where are they at in their season? Those kind of things. I think the best climber has a very strong internal ethic. I think that's almost non-negotiable. I think someone can climb a very hard grade, and if they don't have strong internal ethics, you're just not gonna find very many people who are gonna agree that that person is like the best climber. Like if you imagine someone flew to Finland and like repeated burden, but their foot brushed the pad, and then they like flew to Switzerland and they repeated Alphane, but their foot brushed the pad. It's like, would that person be in the conversation for being the best climber? Yeah, but every single person is going to bring up the fact that they dabbed on those ascents. I think being unimpeachably ethical is like almost a necessity to be the best climber. And then honestly, the last thing, which is kind of on like parallel to what Sam was saying about social stuff, like supportive of their partners and stuff, I think they have to be fun to be around. Like you can't be the best climber even if you have all these other things if you're just a total dick. Like first of all, that's going to hamstring you in the long run, because if you're a total dick, nobody's going to want to climb with you, and everybody climbs a little bit better when they have other people, building them up and giving them beta and things like that. So I think you have to be a chill guy a little bit to be the best climber. And I should have started with this, but I reject the premise that being a better climber means moving up the grade scale. I think that's kind of silliness. I think I became a better climber concurrently with moving up the grade scale, but have seen plenty of cases where somebody becomes a better climber without moving up the scale, or moves up the scale, sometimes even pretty far, and manages to never become a better climber along the way. All right. Jake asks, can you give any project shopping tips or advice for those of us who get too excited and want to try everything? How can I narrow down my existing list of too many projects to a few dedicated climbs I know I want to try in a season? Okay, I'm probably a bad person to ask this question because I'm a total overstoker and I also like to try lots of things. But one practical piece of advice I can give is just don't have a list. You're either going to wind up being where you need to be. You're going to remember the things that are most important to you even without a list, and you're going to find yourself at the climbs that you sort of should be at or need to be at. Or you'll wind up somewhere else and you won't mind that you wound up somewhere else because it's where you want to be. So I think going with the flow is very important here, but that also includes like following your motivation if it takes you somewhere else. I think there's like a time management for mere mortals type approach of like, just accept that you're going to die and you're not going to do all the rock climbs, and then you can start choosing which ones are most important to you. That's kind of a nihilistic way to view it, but I do think that it's true. And just from a practical standpoint, I think if you already have like 2 mega projects open for the season and they're both really hard, hopefully they're slightly different. I think that's helpful, but I just wouldn't open a 3rd mega project that season unless you're definitely going to get rid of one of the other ones. Like, any like classic advice for being hyper consumerist is that if you're going to buy a new shirt, you need to like get rid of an old shirt so that you don't wind up with too many things in your closet. And I think the same is true of projects. Like, just don't take on too many at the same time and try to make them as complementary as you can. I think having a loose theme or goal for the season is pretty helpful. Like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to like bring up the base a little bit, or you're trying to reach a new peak, you're trying to like work on that middle tier where you're trying to bring a new peak into focus. You know, if you have sort of a theme like that, it might make it a little bit easier to pick things. But I really, more and more, I think that natural motivation, just trying what you are psyched to try without relying on a list or a guidebook, and then also serendipity, are probably the two most powerful pieces of advice that I can give. Okay, Ethan asks, I've noticed when I go on a sport climbing trip, I spend around 7 to 10 days climbing, roughly 2 days on, 1 day off, staying between a difficulty level around on-site and third or fourth go. The trip ends, and when I return to my local crags, my endurance feels incredibly high. Would it be effective to try and simulate this in the gym across the span of, say, 10 days while transitioning from a bouldering focus season into a sport climbing season? For example, spending 10 days rope climbing in the gym, going 2 days on, 1 off, and keeping the intensity in the low to medium range. My current approach for the early season is usually jumping straight on my project and trying links. I'm starting to think I may be leaving some endurance gains on the table by not including a small volume phase. Yeah, I guess there's not actually a question there, but I think this makes sense, and I've experienced kind of similar things myself. I think probably the important thing to notice first is when you go on that trip at the beginning of the season, or I guess it doesn't have to be the beginning of the season, but if you were to go on a trip like that at the beginning of the season, you're definitely getting some physical gains, but I think it's important that we pay attention to like what those gains would be. So, 7 to 10 days, 2 on, 1 off, is not a long enough time to make significant capacity, like work capacity gains. You definitely make some strength endurance, like on the wall type gains. But I think the biggest place you're probably making gains is like the technical sort of, and the mindset and like how you approach your climbing, how you feel on the wall, which I think I would usually summarize as like your rock sense or your flow. And that's the part that you would probably want to be recapturing if you were going to do some sort of volume phase before your season or before jumping on your project. I mean, I definitely think if you're going straight from bouldering to trying your project and jumping right into links and stuff, for a lot of people, that's not going to give you that really good like rock sense or flow sort of sensation. It's going to take quite a long time to build that up climbing on the project. Although often developing specific endurance on the project is like kind of a necessary step anyway. It might make sense to do like an intermediate phase where you climb on easier routes and try to develop a little bit of that flow first. And I agree, like my best sport seasons have also come after periods of sport climbing outside, and doing a lot of volume, and not necessarily just when I'm in good physical shape. So I think to me, doing it outside makes more sense than doing it in the gym, just because gym routes tend to be shorter, very pumpy, very sustained. The gym is higher volume, because you're not like having to go between routes and you're not like enjoying being outside. You don't get any of the other non-specific benefits of spending a lot of time outside that you would be getting if you were going on a trip. So it would be an interesting experiment to run, but I'm dubious that you would get the exact same benefits from doing it in the gym that you would get from doing it on a trip. I think the fact that you're on a trip probably has quite a lot to do with it. But maybe that's, an approach to consider for the future when you can like plan around it, to go on a short sport climbing trip at the beginning of the season and try to give yourself this little endurance boost that you feel like you get from going on a trip. Maybe that's a beneficial strategy to try. Okay, Jantina says, in 4 years of climbing, I have rarely seen anyone brush holds on gym sets or boards. People often walk up to me while I'm brushing in the gym and ask me why I'm doing it. And I've never seen anyone brush holds on outdoor routes. I routinely encounter routes ranging from 510 to 512 with chalk-caked holds and numerous tick marks, which interferes with genuine on-site attempts, creates more work for me to clean up if I'm projecting, and it's just not nice to look at. I agree. In addition to brushing crux holds before every send attempt, I brush any obvious chalk off every sport route before leaving it, including easier warm-up routes, but it seems like this is not standard practice. So, can you emphasize the importance of brushing holds indoors and outdoors? In particular, what is the brushing etiquette for outdoor sport routes? Any other advice about brushing? Yeah, there's a tragedy of the commons thing where I think a lot of harder sport routes probably get regularly brushed because individual people who are trying those routes probably know that brushing the holds is going to increase their friction and give them a higher chance of sending. But very few people are willing to put the time in to, lower down the route and maybe clip into the wall as they go and like brush all the holds on like a easier route. Of course, every easier route is somebody's project. So, presumably that etiquette could carry all the way down, but I think so. Yeah, it's kind of a bummer, but I don't know if I see that really changing, even if we were all to start making a lot more noise about it. But that said, we can all make more noise about it. So there definitely is a basic etiquette to brushing. Personally, I think if someone is, if you're trying boulders with people and someone is not doing any brushing at all, I think it becomes quite obvious. But maybe that's just my bias. Maybe other people don't notice it. If I'm trying a project, I'm always going to brush the whole thing before I pull on for a boulder. And for a sport route, I'm always going to brush at least the crux every time I come down. I might not brush the whole sport route necessarily, but even with those things, I think, especially with boulders, you see a buildup over time that sort of needs a deeper clean than just brushing. And so in places like Waco, they actually have like a cleanup where they go around with these like backpack sprayers, the same as you would use for, killing weeds. You would put like a, weed killer of some kind in the sprayer. And they just spray water. Maybe it's like water and a little alcohol. I'm not sure actually exactly what it is, but they spray all the holds with it and brush things really thoroughly and then spray them again. And then, the friction is restored at least for a short time. I'm sure it's still degraded in the long run. But, it is sort of a part of our sport that we don't talk about a lot, that the rock is not a renewable resource. It is a limited time offer, and every time we climb on it, we are degrading it. So it probably behooves us all to take a little bit more care of it than we're maybe inclined to, and maybe taking a little more care of like the warm-up routes too. Couple minor etiquette things. Tick marks are fine while you're trying a problem or trying a route, but they should not be left on the problem or route when you leave. So personally, I think if you're going to tick a sport route, it should be done in a very subtle and careful way. Obvious tick marks on a sport route are just very unlikely to get cleaned off, and so it's going to be quite unsightly for everyone. It's easier to clean them off of a boulder, but it's also, that means it's even more important that you clean them before you leave, because there's just nothing preventing you from cleaning it when you leave. So I personally get quite frustrated when I know I'm trying the same project as other people and they're leaving it in really poor condition every time they leave, and I'm leaving it pristine for them. I feel like they're not doing their part to help me send the boulder, but I'm doing my part to help them send the boulder, which you might not even know who that person is. You just know that they've been there, and that is a little bit frustrating when you're helping some stranger and they're not sharing the load. Other minor etiquette things: keep your brush clean. So if your brush, falls in the dirt, like, you might want to rinse it off at home before you use it. And I am not sure why people do this exactly, but if holds are wet, don't mash chalk onto them with your brush. I'm not sure why I've seen people do that a bunch of times, but chalk is not like chalk's not a towel that's going to absorb moisture. And if a hold is wet and you're mashing chalk onto it, you're just grinding that moisture and chalk into the surface of the rock and probably reducing the friction for everybody. So please don't do that. Just wait for the holds to be dry. You could use a fan. That's a good option. Okay, Adit says, I listened to a podcast from Nate Drolet about climbing 514, and he brings up the idea of stepping stone routes, essentially routes that have the same skill or manifestation needed to get you up to your main route. Do you believe in the same concept for boulders, or are each too unique for this to work? Okay, yeah, I absolutely believe in this concept. It's something I use extensively in my own bouldering, to the point that I actually don't think pyramids of grades really make all that much sense. Like, if you build a whole pyramid in Joe's Valley and then you go to Waco, doing 10 V6s in Joe's Valley does not necessarily mean you're ready to climb V7 or 8 in Waco. They're just, they might have some of the same skills, but it's definitely not guaranteed. Maybe a better example would be like doing 10 513s in the red and then going to Smith. You're definitely not ready to climb 514 at Smith. The style and the exact set of challenges presented by each route or boulder, it really, really matters. And for sport climbing and bouldering, they both have their like sort of mindset things that are true regardless of the terrain you're climbing on. But yeah, I think the actual moves themselves and the physical demands and stuff, I think it really pays to pay attention to those things and try to pick some second tier goals that are at least somewhat similar to your main goal. And one of the biggest reasons to do that is physical preparedness, but also just the confidence of knowing that you're good in that style. So a couple examples of this, like I want to climb a problem called Sling Blade Sit someday. And there's lots of other problems here around Leavenworth that have lots of the same things that Sling Blade does, just like super high right heel hook where I'm loading my hamstring a lot. And so I kind of have a list in the back of my head of like 10s and 11s that I haven't done. Sling Blade is a 13. I have a list of like 10s and 11s I haven't done that have similar demands, especially on my hamstring, that I can kind of hopefully send as a little bit of a launch pad to feel like my hamstring is really ready to try super hard on sling. Because the last time I had a long siege on sling, I chronically sprained it. So that would just be an example of like how I think about this kind of thing. Another example is like using this for warming up for your project. Like when I was trying Encore une fois in Squamish, and then I also did the V12 version sur le toit. I don't speak great French, sorry. They're like left to right traverses, both of them, and then Encore actually goes back right to left again. But it's all left heel hooks either way. And every time I would go try Encore, I would pick a new like V5 to 8. Encore's V11, Sur is V12. I would pick a new like V5 to 8 somewhere in the forest that I hadn't done, that I thought based on videos I had seen or based on the guidebook picture, things that I thought had left heel hooks on them, really of any kind. So I would basically pick a new left to right lip traverse to do every day that I went to Encore. I would just go try to flash or try to send fast another climb. And that's one reason the Squamish is just really cool, is I was able to do that every day that I was working on Encore and Sur. And so I think it took me 12 days total to do Sur le Toit. So by the time I had done it, I had also done 12 new moderates, like in the same style. And, you know that your specific set of physical things are going to be warmed up when you go to your main project. And you're also just building confidence the whole season on the exact thing that you need for your main project. So it's kind of like a nice, it just feels like you're building towards something in a really skill-based and specific way instead of just in a very general numeric way. Okay. Nadaladacourt asks, if you had zero budgetary constraints, would you have made any different choices for your home wall, dimensions, holds, volumes, etc.? Also, would that change your preference for a spray wall versus a system board? Which system board would you get if you could either replace or augment your current board with one? Have you climbed on the new Kilter home wall? Would I have made any different choices for my home wall? Well, I would have made it bigger, probably. I mean, right now I'm limited by it being in a garage. I think maybe the easiest way for me to answer this question is just to say what I would do in the perfect world, which is hopefully have some kind of, either like a shed or just a different outbuilding that's big enough to have a bunch of things in it. Probably wouldn't be climate controlled. But I think I'd be willing to deal with that in order to have more space. And right now I would probably go with the TB2. I haven't climbed on the 2024 moon board. I have not climbed on the Kilter home wall. To be fair, I also haven't climbed on a decoy board. So there's like a few things that I haven't tried, but to be honest, I haven't seen anything that indicates to me that any of them are even going to come remotely close to the TB2, just in terms of the variety of movement that you can get out of it, the thoughtfulness that's gone into every single hold, the positioning of every hold. Even the dual text is like incredibly well thought out. I mean, every time I climb on a TB2, I'm just really impressed at the level of analysis and forethought that went into creating it. I don't work with tension. I'm not paid by them or anything. I just think it's a really, really impressive feat of engineering that they pulled off. I'm sure all the other boards are really fun to climb on, and I've had great sessions on all the other boards I've climbed on, but I would never consider having any of the other boards at home. Whereas the TB2, it's kind of just a question of if I had enough money and space for it, I would absolutely have one. And that if I could, perfect world, TB2 would be adjustable. And other than that, I would also do a spray wall. I think I would do a spray wall with more angle changes, so kind of like a barrel feature would be cool. And also with like rounded on the sides, like the wings that I have on my current board, and possibly more volumes. Basically, the TB2 would be the flat plane technique, and then I would want to be able to fit in lots more different types of terrain on the spray wall. And then, yeah, why not just say like a World Cup, vert wall where I can set single moves on there too? Because ideally, if I had this sort of space, I would do coaching in it, and I would want to, set problems for people to climb on that were maybe a little more specific, or even be able to like change the problem while I'm working with someone in the space. So if I'm dreaming, I might as well dream big, right? And then, squat rack and a few machines and all that stuff. No canvas board, but pretty much everything else would be good. Okay, Fu has a few questions. I'll just take these one at a time. So number one, do you keep any data from the climbers you coach? If yes, how do you plan to use it? If not, why not? So I don't keep any data in any sort of specific way from everyone that I coach. For a while, I was doing like in-person testing with people. Technically, I still do that. It's just now that I live in Wenatchee, it's not as popular of a thing. And so I do have a spreadsheet with the numbers of people that I had tested at the time, but really, and this will be more obvious in my answer to the second question, but the more I tested people, the more I just realized that the numbers are only important for that person. So the only value of having those numbers is as long as I'm coaching that person and we want to be looking at, what they're gaining from the training and what kind of shape they're in. There's really, to me, almost no value in comparing the metrics across climbers. Maybe if you were coaching a team and you really wanted to push people, you could create some competitive sort of spirit there. But truthfully, the kinds of tests that we generally use in climbing, I think, are so based on our genetics and stuff. Like, it just doesn't create a lot of value to me. And this is why I'm so cynical about, taking people's test results and telling them they're ready to climb whatever grade. I just think that's a really foolish leap to make. And I think it does a lot of psychological harm to climbers. So I have the data, I keep the data, but I really only use it in the sense of working with an individual. Second question, do you think measuring metrics in climbing is a good thing or a bad thing in general? I think the fact that we can measure, the fact that we have tools like a Tindeck and we can measure is definitely a good thing. But I think it has more applications for rehab and like readiness measurement. So like seeing if today is a good day to try at your absolute limit. I think it has more applications in those realms than it does in just general overall training for most people most of the time. Again, it just goes back to that, it can do good for you, but it can also do harm for you. And generally speaking, it's not necessary. And so I think taking the risk of doing harm is just it's not that helpful personally. If I primarily coached people who were elite, like if I was working with a World Cup team or something like that, I might have a different answer to this question. But the really funny thing is, I also think a lot of, World Cup teams and things are probably much more technically focused and doing even less measuring maybe than like the advanced sort of very internet aware, but like climbing pretty hard, but not professional climbers. Like I think that crowd probably tests the most. And then I think a lot of the pro climbers actually don't really care that much. But I could be wrong about that. I don't really know that many pro climbers. So, third question, how do you guide a new climber or a friend who's just starting out if they're too focused on tracking metrics? Well, more than one person I've coached, I've just told them to straight up stop. I've just said, I don't think this is really helping you. And whether they take my advice or not, obviously is up to them. But I think if we can get people to break away from the sort of sense of causality that if they make the numbers go up, they're going to climb harder, it just tends to be better for people's climbing. I think it's just healthier and more productive to focus on other things. But I totally relate to people, and I feel for them just with how tricky it is to get better at climbing when it's so abstract. Like we really just want to know where we're at so that we can have a clear sense of whether we're getting better or not. And I understand that that requires being really okay with just not knowing precisely where you're at, But the truth is the metrics don't actually tell you exactly where you're at either. They just relieve your anxiety about not knowing where you're at. And if you can make the number go up, you sort of feel like you're getting better. But the truth is, for everybody, that is going to come back to square one of how are you actually doing on the wall and what kind of outcomes are you actually getting in your climbing. You've just sort of gotten yourself to think about something else for a while. So I think the sooner you give up on chasing that rabbit, the sooner you can focus on chasing the rabbits that matter, which in my mind is like actually performing on the wall. Like if you want to test yourself, try a hard problem or a hard route. Like that's how you test yourself. And is it complicated to understand how you're doing on that and where you're at in the process? Yeah, it's complicated, but I think it's a much more realistic measurement of who you are as a rock climber and how you're doing as a rock climber than, your finger strength or your pull-up numbers or something like that. Other coaches might have a different take on that for sure. All right, Stephanie has a great question. She asks, can you explain what dry firing is exactly? Like in my mind, I assume it's a mix of skin, body tension, the way force is applied, etc. But can you break down what causes dry firing and if there are things we can do to prevent it? I don't dry fire often, but it's so jarring when it happens. Okay, I think the easy way to think about dry firing is just imagine, when you have a rubber band, like if you were stretching a rubber band out, like you were going to snap it so that it would fly at somebody. You have all this tension in the rubber band, all this like elastic energy in the rubber band, and that's potential energy, right? By stretching the rubber band, you've created this potential energy. And then when you release the rubber band, that energy is released. So when we're climbing, we are also creating a lot of potential energy, and we are also creating a lot of stretch in the system, a lot of tension, right? But we also are reliant on friction. So there's a thing called the friction coefficient. We don't always have a ton of friction, but if there's, if you're on like a granite sloper, for instance, there might be a lot of friction. If you're on like a wood hold in the gym, there might be a lot less friction, in which case it's more about the normal force. So just like how hard we're pulling on the holds. And when the friction changes, sometimes what happens is we slip, right? And right at that moment that you slip, it's like the rubber band snapping, right? It's like suddenly all that energy in the system is released, and you're going to get this like big jarring sensation. Exactly like you said, it's like very jarring. Like you're going to get this big like burst of power kind of going in a random direction, but also almost always going down because of gravity. And so dry firing is almost a little bit more like you go to pull the rubber band back and snap it at your friend, but the rubber band, breaks and it kind of like snaps back, maybe even hits you or like goes in a random direction, right? I think the other important thing to understand about dry firing is it sometimes does happen when we're just holding on. Like sometimes the friction just changes very slightly, like your body position changes ever so subtly, or there's some tiny amount of moisture or something really, really minute happens if you're holding on by a small enough thread. But most of the time it happens while we're moving. And the reason that happens is because there's a loss of friction. So if you imagine like you're holding a hold at one angle, and as you move upwards, your angle that your fingers are engaging with the hold is changing, right? So you either need more force to stay on that hold than you did before, so you suddenly have to start squeezing harder through the hold, or the surface area that's actually connected to the hold is changing. You may have less surface area than you did before. Like when you think about foot slips, almost always they happen because the position of the foot on the foothold has changed, and the surface area that's in contact is different surface area, which sometimes means you need different tension in the body, but it also just means that there's different friction. So like if you lose a bunch of surface area suddenly, the chance of slipping is really high. You're going to lose friction. And then you have, like we said, all that tension in the system is going to suddenly do something. You're just while you're climbing, like you're squeezing your body. You're like a coiled spring. So as soon as you lose that friction, like, think about what a rubber band does. It's going to try to snap back into the position that it's usually in. It has all that elastic force, and that's exactly what your arms are going to do, or what your body's going to do when you have a dry fire. The only thing I can say about what's changed for me in terms of dry firing, because I do have really dry skin, I've always been very friction reliant, and so I think I learned pretty early on like how to feel how much connection I have to the rock and sort of know whether I'm going to dry fire or not, and try not to. But it really is that change in your surface area, or change in your hand position or your foot position. Like those are the things to pay attention to in order to slip less. And you will get better at it over time with climbing. Like your body will just sort of learn what it needs to do in order to stay tense or to keep those positions as best they can. But it is something you can pay attention to, and just notice that it's happening. When you watch your video and you see yourself dry firing, you're going to see something that changed in your wrist angle or your forearm angle, or in your ankle if we're talking about like a foot slip and not a dry fire. Like you'll start to notice those things and understand like what it is that happened that caused the friction to change. Okay, Brian had a question. He didn't really have a question. He left me a voice note. So I'm going to try to reproduce his voice note. He wanted me to expand a little bit on a concept that I talked about. I think I actually talked about this on my Instagram stories, that most people, even if they're climbing pretty hard, so let's say you're climbing, this just makes the math easier. Let's say you're climbing V10 regularly. That person is still much closer to someone who's climbing V5 regularly than they are to someone who's climbing V15 regularly. And Brian wanted me to just expand on what I mean by that. So basically, it's, first of all, the grades, in my opinion, get bigger as you go. And I don't know exactly if that's true at V15 and 16 and 17, because I just haven't seriously engaged with anything of that difficulty. But I'm reasonably certain that those grades are like super wide up there at the top end. Certainly everything 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, I'm very confident that those grades get bigger as you go, and they're harder as you go. And I don't just mean harder like 12 plus 1 equals 13, but I think there's actually a bigger step than that personally. And then when I say wider, I just mean I think they overlap more dramatically with the ones around them, with the adjacent grades. So to me, it's just like on the scale, because it's kind of, someone who knows more about math than me, chime in here and tell me if I'm saying the wrong one, but it's either logarithmic or exponential. On that curve, 10 is just closer to 5 than it is to 15 by like a pretty significant amount. So yeah, I hope that it's not like, I hope that it's not discouraging for people to hear that. But I think one thing that's useful to pay attention to is just to be more interested in your relative potential than to be interested in absolute potential. Because the people who are climbing 14 and 15 and 16, which may even include people who are listening to this podcast, just very likely have a set of things that put them on that path that is, relatively unlikely for a lot of people to have. So my original point with sharing this was just that I think people who are really obsessed with the sport and are engaging with the sport a lot and are like, for instance, I keep throwing this grade out, but it's not important what the grade is. But let's say somebody who's climbing V10, several times a season or something like that. I think those people are inclined to be like, well, I'm serious about the sport. I pay a lot of attention to it. I'm listening to training podcasts. I'm engaging with it constantly. I'm getting, I'm doing double digis. I'm like I'm the real deal, you know, and then they're going to see what someone who's climbing V15 is doing for training. And they're going to think like, because that person is really engaged with the sport, that they should train like the V15 person. And just from a physiology and genetics and like training point of view, I think most people who are climbing V10 regularly are probably much more similar to people who are climbing V5 regularly. Certainly more similar to those people than they probably think, which doesn't mean, and I think I clarified this when I posted on my stories, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't push yourself and you know, try outlandish training things that V15 people do. And so I think it's okay to play around with that stuff for sure. You're certainly never going to find out if you're a freak if you don't push yourself in some kind of freakish ways. But in the words of one Instagram freak or another of the people who I follow, I think maybe it was Alec Blennis, you know, if you were a freak, you'd know it by now, right? And so I think the point that I'm trying to make with this comparison is just it's more important to pay attention to the general rules of strength and conditioning and the general rules of human physiology than it is to pay attention to what the outliers are doing. And just to remember that like most of us are in the middle of the bell curve, and that's where the science happens, and that's where we actually have the science. The stuff that's happening on either end of the bell curve is just not that relevant to most people most of the time. And if you're listening to this and you live on the outside edge of that bell curve, sick, dude. Good for you. Okay, Nico asks, pros, cons of taking a longer-term maintenance period with minimal training to prioritize more time climbing outside, and advice you would have for someone doing this. Currently, I'm planning for 6 months of maintenance training with 2 lifting sessions per week at high RPE, but very low volume. Yeah, pros and cons. Well, I think 6 months of doing 2 lifting sessions per week at high RPE but low volume. I mean, if you're also climbing and you're eating plenty of food and recovering well and stuff, I would expect that to maintain very well. I would actually think most people could probably make strength gains at that volume of lifting, you know, unless they were like a very well-trained weightlifter, or the climbing volume was crazy high. I think actually twice a week, 30 to 45 minutes is plenty to make gains. So I don't even know if that's strictly a maintenance dose, but even going lower dose than that, doing 1 day a week with a similar volume would probably be fine. Like I've had good experiences with doing just like a 3x3 or even a 2x3 at a high RPE of a handful of exercises and maintaining really well across those exercises. I think the obvious pro is that you enter your next training season physically still pretty strong. You stay a little bit more hale during your climbing season. And the obvious con is just you lose a little bit of energy in the short term. So, you know, if you train and lift on Thursday and you're going climbing on Saturday, you're probably going to be like slightly more tired than if you didn't lift weights on Thursday, especially if the RPE is really high. But the counter argument is like if you never did the lifting, then you're going to start to feel bad on Saturdays no matter what, because you're going to slowly be detraining, right? So it's sort of a straightforward trade-off, in my opinion. If you're thinking about your climbing in an in-season, off-season type of way, then you're probably already getting a lot of the benefits. I think 6 months is pretty long for like an in-season, and setting aside, you know, maintaining your strength using lifting, I just think it's a long time to do performance-oriented rock climbing. I think some athletes can get away with that depending on where they are and their age and a lot of other stuff. But for me personally, once I start to stretch my performance window past 4, 5, 6 months, I start to just, my injuries stop feeling better. My little tweaks stop healing. You know, I start to accumulate more stuff, and I just need a longer break. So 6 months is definitely pushing it. And if you talk to like climbers in Chattanooga or Vegas, those kind of areas where they have a really long winter performance and then a really long summer off season, a lot of them, you know, will be struggling with training overuse problems by the end of summer and climbing overuse problems by the end of winter. And they just are used to sort of oscillating like that. That's the nature of the beast in those areas. And then, you know, more up here in the Northwest, like where I am, we get shorter cycles. And I think those allow me to not go quite as deep into any particular tweak or recovery hole. Not everybody's in control of their in and off seasons, but if you are, that's probably something worth considering, is just like what the cadence is that you're doing those things. I've also had, I know I'm just kind of rambling related to this question, but I've had good success with having people do like a training block, a very short training block in their performance season. So like if you're a Vegas climber, for instance, maybe climbing outside primarily November, December, and then, maybe like taking a week off for the holidays, like a week off from training and climbing, and then just doing like 3 weeks where you climb outside a little less, you lift a little more, you do a little bit more like gym climbing in January, and then taking another week off, and then hitting February and March, a little bit harder, versus hitting January really hard, hitting February really hard, and then by the end of February, March, you're just like running pretty ragged. That's been like a pretty decent strategy, especially, again, depending on the athlete and their age and all that stuff. Okay, folks, that is all the questions for September. Thank you for listening. Thanks for submitting your questions. And sorry, this one was a little late. So I will be back for the October AMA in early November. And more than likely, that will be my first AMA as a dad. So expect some very hazy, highly caffeinated, rambly answers to your questions. And then after that, they should start improving slowly over time as I get acclimated to sleeping somehow even less than I sleep these days. So thanks for listening, folks. Catch you in the next one.